Thank you, Victoria. I'm going to try and forget the cameras there. You can edit that bit out. So first of all, before anything else, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that this presentation was written on the traditional, on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nations, on ceded land. And I'd like to recognise them as the custodians of the longest continuous culture on Earth and the enduring custodians of all the lands, airs and waters that sustain us. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander colleagues and friends here this afternoon. I acknowledge that sovereignty of those lands were never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Okay, so I first of all also want to thank Victoria for blind dating me. It was wonderful. The dates have been wonderful on Zoom, but it's even more lovely to meet in person. And I just feel very privileged to be part of these conversations. I am acutely aware that I am coming, this work that I'm going to talk about comes from the UK. I want to acknowledge centre and margin in that relationship. And I offer this sort of case study to you really for your kind of thoughts and responses and to see where it intersects with the incredible work that we've been talking about over the past 36 hours. I guess where this is going to sit is very much with the kind of crisis that Victoria was talking about this morning, the crisis within the humanities. And I also really like the idea of moving beyond the kind of conversation within the humanities disciplines and kind of lifting our gaze. I think that's such an important phrase. You know, as our symposium description incisively notes, the humanities are in a state of transition. Something of that transition has been brought about by very pervasive political rhetoric, particularly in the higher education sector, about the low value of the humanities disciplines. I said last night that's actually a Rishi Sunak, this is from the UK, and I hate to bring that name even into this discussion this afternoon, but low value is actually a kind of Tory term for the humanities degrees, particularly when those disciplines and degrees are calibrated against the STEM disciplines or vocational subjects such as law and medicine. But I think the thing about lifting our gaze is to say that that rhetoric is pervasive, but we are at a juncture ourselves where we actually have to articulate, perhaps first to ourselves, how essential the humanities are to human flourishing, to social justice, and to the ethical navigation of the multiple global crises that beset us. So this is about, I suppose, having a kind of ambitious, a kind of vision around where the HAS disciplines sit in relation to STEM. And our first problem, I would argue, is that kind of reductive binary opposition between HAS and STEM. As Jacques Derrida notes in Of Grammatology, quote, "We must recognise that within the familiar philosophical oppositions, there is always a violent hierarchy. And much of what I'm going to argue in this paper is that binary oppositions are always problematic. If you're pathologically optimistic, I'm pathologically opposed to binary oppositions." And so I think in terms of thinking about the binary between HAS and STEM, the critical work that we have to undertake is to deconstruct these kind of binaries. And it strikes me through the discussions that we're having also here too about, kind of the arts sector, or if we're thinking about centre and region, city, country, also in relation to well-being, illness and health. All of these binary oppositions are deeply reductive, and I think the way forward, I think it's a term that Javier used this morning, is to think in terms of thirdness and third space. And so the work that I'm going to talk about that we undertook within the kind of medical education and humanities education settings in London is about trying to find that third space, create third space, really uphold the principle of thirdness. So what I'm going to do, first of all, is deconstruct my own sort of title a little bit. The collapsing of a binary brings me, or the idea that we must always deconstruct collapsed binaries, brings me to the first keyword in that title, and that's transdisciplinary. So I just want to think about that term as a start. So here, and this is from 1994, this is a group that was led by the physicist Basarab Niculescu, a group that wrote the Charter of Transdisciplinarity, principally as a group of scientists, but I think doing their own self-reflexive work about their relationship with the arts and humanities and social sciences, trying to reflect on the kind of dominance of science. Niculescu and his colleagues note that the present proliferation of academic and non-academic disciplines is leading to an exponential increase in knowledge, which makes a global view of the human being impossible. So there's this sort of weird kind of counterintuitive kind of truth here that the more we proliferate our disciplines and think in disciplinary silos, the less we actually can think globally about what it means to be human being. So counterintuitively, the more knowledge we make in silos, the less we actually understand about the complexity of human subjectivity and experience. We end up with knowledge sequestered within disciplinary confines and not put into dialogue with other perspectives and ways of knowing. Now, in the Charter, they give a kind of list of articles, and there's a couple of those that I'd like to focus in on. So this is Article 5. It specifically calls upon the sciences to open themselves up to the Haas disciplines and indeed to creative and spiritual practices. And I think in this sense, we've talked a lot about the arts. It's important to note that they're not simply here talking about sort of academic disciplines, but they are also thinking about art, the creative arts, and also spirituality, which is not something we've talked a lot about yet. So the transdisciplinary vision, they write, is resolutely open insofar as it goes beyond the field of the exact sciences and demands their dialogue and their reconciliation with the humanities and the social sciences, as well as with art, literature, poetry, and spiritual experience. Their kind of challenge there in Article 5 is to the sciences themselves. But importantly, transdisciplinary practice builds bigger capacity and understanding. Open working between the disciplines produces more than the sum of its parts. And I think it's this particular article that kind of speaks to the work really that I think we need to think about in terms of lifting our gaze. This is about the building of new capacity, new knowledge. Transdisciplinarity complements disciplinary approaches, they write. It occasions the emergence of new data and new interactions out of the encounter between disciplines. It offers us a new vision of nature and reality. So exploding reductive binaries then offers radical potential. And to come back to this idea of third space or thirdness, that what the disciplines, when we bring them together, offer is the making of new knowledge. So let me then turn to, sorry, a little early, let's hold him back for a minute, let's just hold with this. Let me turn to the second keyword in my title, and that's futures. So somewhat counterintuitively, I do want to think about something or a kind of narrative from the past in order to help us think about the future. I'd like to take us back briefly to a mid-20th century formulation of the relationship, or rather the kind of lack of relationship between literature and science. So this is physical chemist and novelist C.P. Snow, writing in what was published of his Reed Lectures from 1959. Snow very negatively argues that he believes that the intellectual life of the whole of Western society is increasingly being split into two polar groups. Literary intellectuals at one pole, at the other scientists, and as the most representative, the physical scientists. Between the two, Snow writes, the gulf of mutual incomprehension, sometimes, particularly among the young, hostility and dislike, but most of all, a lack of understanding. So this idea of the two cultures that we have, we have the kind of the arts and the humanities on one side, sciences on the other. In these 1959 Reed Lectures, Snow makes that contentious pronouncement that such a profound division and animosity have come to exist between the arts, humanities and the sciences that these cultures have literally hived off into what he calls two cultures. So if we were going to put that in a kind of Venn diagram, we probably couldn't put it into a Venn diagram because, of course, they exist as two separate and boundary domains, obscure and unknowable to each other, unable to find any points of connection. They remain disconnected circles. Now, this is not from 1959. We might ask, look, does this model, this two cultures model, does it actually still exist? Well, interestingly, there's another sort of reference to the two cultures debate, actually only the other day, and I didn't have time to put it into the slides, but this is to take us back to 2021 and to think about a kind of moment in the pandemic when the two cultures model is sort of being reanimated, is being explored in terms of how we are responding, how we were responding at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic to the pandemic. And American historian Nicholas Dirks argued that the perpetuation of the two cultures delineated by snow is still very much present on college campuses. And I guess we might want to think about each of our own campuses if we're in universities, and kind of ask whether it's still the case, of course, that this two cultures model is still relevant. We might think about it in terms of funding and argue, well, it would appear to be. But as Dirks also argues in this article, the pandemic as a global crisis still represents an urgent opportunity to overcome the divisions and pull the HASS and STEM disciplines together in a commitment to sharing knowledge and insight in order to overcome the virus. And in this article, he thinks about, it's a very kind of important example within the pandemic, he thinks about the example of COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy. And if I can use the kind of example from the UK here, this kind of sense that biomedical science very quickly develops the COVID vaccines, but suddenly discovers that actually there are certain demographics, certain communities don't want a bar of these vaccines and don't trust the kind of the urgency of the science that's produced the vaccines and not prepared to take them. So in the UK, if we think about the BAME communities who carry a long history of being unethically utilised in clinical trials, not surprising that there's this refusal to engage with the COVID-19 vaccines. And unless we apply historical and cultural theoretical lenses to understand those behaviours, in other words, the kind of critical thinking of the HASS disciplines, we're not going to understand that kind of behaviour. Biomedical science could produce the vaccine, but it couldn't provide the knowledge and innovation to kind of understand the cultural and affective human responses. So Dirks talks about this in this article and argues it demonstrates the profound necessity of bridging those two cultures, in a transdisciplinary move towards collaboration and the co-construction of knowledge and capabilities. Now, we might want to think about this, and Victoria talked about the kind of work I've done in the medical humanities. A lot of it has been within the kind of field of medical education. We might consider the kind of two cultures model from this very sort of slightly different angle, then not about biomedical science, but more about how we train our clinicians of the future, particularly within the realm of Western biomedicine. And this is American medical educator Hedy Wald and her group, who write there, urge caution, if you like, about the incredible drivers of biomedical science, the kind of positivist, evidence-based methodologies and epistemological frameworks of that science, but that have kind of delivered something of a crisis in how we train our young clinicians. So to quote Hedy Wald, with the rapid advancement of technology in science and medicine, aligned with increasing pressures of productivity, are we able still to cultivate and preserve the necessary balance with humanistic care and caring, the art and science of medicine? Fundamental to all this is whether physicians and healthcare practitioners in general are equipped to deal with what their patients in the 21st century, and indeed their what their patients need in the 21st century, and whether indeed their education is geared to a prepared heart and mind. So what I want to do is to kind of think about some of the ways that we kind of address this issue in some of the work that I did with clinicians from St George's Medical School in London. But so I'll come to that kind of case study in a minute, but I just want to think a little bit, just to press a little bit further on this idea of the two cultures model. I think I just want to dig in here to a little bit about what we might think about when we think about culture. This infographic would suggest that people occupy the heart of a culture, but that cultures are also defined by their differences, by different behaviours, histories, beliefs, languages. And I want to think about this two cultures model in terms of the differences we might understand as existing between medical culture and lay culture. And so just to bear with me, I'm a literary scholar, I couldn't resist a little bit of literary material. So I just want to think here about, and this is actually a session that I do with medical students, is to think about the different kinds of cultures and languages that are being represented here when we think about the symptom of night sweats. So on the left-hand side of the screen, we have a poem by Tom Gunn. And on the right-hand side of the screen, we have a kind of medical dictionary definition of night sweats. I hope that's very small. I hope you can read it. But on the right, that medical dictionary definition is factual. It's devoid of affect. even though the potential diagnoses it's talking about, tuberculosis and AIDS, are potentially devastating diagnoses. Now, in a way, representing the kind of factual definition of a night sweat is understandable. A clinician needs accurate technical language. But by contrast, Tom Gunn's The Man with Night Sweats articulates the complex affective terrain of waking up in San Francisco in the 1980s as a gay man with a night sweat and being terrified about whether this symptom indicates his infection with the HIV virus. Rights of embodiment, of fear, loss of function, impending mortality. And in a way, what I'm trying to pitch here in terms of this sort of thing about cultures is the way in which the language of the clinician often ends up versus or in opposition with the language of the patient. As another literary example, and this is just a page from the script of Margaret Edson's play Wit from 1995. So just quite beautifully, I think, on the page representing the way in which the languages of two cultures might clash or speak over each other. And some of you may know the play, many may not. We have a clinician here, Kalikian, giving a devastating diagnosis of stage 4 cancer to Vivian Baring, who's a literary scholar. The clinician is, and if you imagine this being performed on stage, the two actors are talking over each other at this point. The clinician here is delivering bad news very badly. But to an educated patient, indeed a literary scholar, who's trying to take that bad news in and in a sort of defended way is using her own sort of literary scholarly apparatus to deconstruct the language of the delivery of the bad news. And it's just a very sort of evocative visual example of that kind of clash of languages, clash of cultures. I think the most compelling area actually in this script is that white gutter down the middle. It's a chasm, certainly a chasm, but it's also a space in which affect might sit. It's also a space in which potentially better communication and care might be possible. So this idea of the thirdness or the third space would be one of the things I would think about there. Now, I'm just aware of time, and I might rush through this bit a little quickly to get to the sort of particularly student voices that I'd like to explore in this paper. But I would say that I think Snow's two cultures model has reverberated down the years and to some degree still informs current understandings of the relationship, actual or desired, between medical humanities and medical education. So now what we have here is the voices of humanities academics. This is a kind of what I'm describing as the kind of friction in the field of medical humanities, where Will Viney and others have identified a problematic trend in which the humanities are instrumentalised in a service or utilitarian mode, what they describe as the humanities being called upon to humanise the objectivity of biomedicine. And this idea of the kind of instrumentalisation of the humanities being a sort of causing friction in the field, and anxiety that somehow we're just being called upon to somehow humanise medicine. Now, certainly there is something to say here about the way in which something like literature might be reductively utilised in that mode, as if we could sort of teach clinicians how to be empathic just by getting them to read a big 19th century novel or something. So, you know, there's this anxiety, I guess. But I think that perhaps the more productive way of understanding, and this is to kind of go back to Victoria's idea of lifting our gaze, is to think beyond those anxieties around instrumentalisation, to start to think about breaking down this binary of what healthcare and care and clinical practice might actually involve in real life, in messy everyday settings, in clinics, in GP surgeries. Now, this is a wonderful colleague of mine from Melbourne, Neville Chiavaroli, who also works in the medical education space. And Neville's argument is much more sophisticated, which is to say, actually, the value of the medical humanities, or the humanities in general, in medical education is not about them making young clinicians more humane. It's actually because it helps them constitute what it means to think like a doctor. So the kind of critical thinking that we teach, those critical skills that we embed within humanities training, and I use that word advisedly, are actually core clinical practice skills two. So we're breaking down that binary opposition between, Has and STEM and saying, actually, we co-constitute each other. And that seems to be an incredibly important move. And so the term that I tend to use here would be to talk about that as an applied medical humanities. Humanities in practice. Okay. So if we were thinking about this kind of remaking this kind of Snow's Venn diagram, we'd think about applied medical humanities as actually being one space, and we might think about other forms of humanities that also do that, perhaps digital humanities or environmental humanities that actually allow the kind of Has and STEM, the silos to come together. Okay. So this infographic, and this is to kind of develop this point. This infographic shows the current outcomes for graduates required by the General Medical Council in the UK. This is a map of the core professional values, behaviours and skills and knowledge that the medical regulator expects a student to have acquired by the end of their undergraduate medical degree, before they head into their foundation years and before they continue out into specialty training and practice. Now, for one thing, you might notice on the bottom band the inclusion of social science principles alongside biomedical scientific principles. The GMC, I would have to say, needs to be taught that the arts and humanities actually exist. They kind of privilege the social sciences here, but I think we might well understand that as including the kind of the humanities within that kind of set of principles. And on the top band, near the head, the kind of strange infographic of the human body, but near the head, on the right-hand side there, I'd also kind of draw your attention to that behaviour that the GMC outlined there, dealing with complexity and uncertainty. Now, a biomedical education delivered purely through scientific practice and culture cannot develop and nurture that capability. Capability is the term that the GMC use to describe those core attributes of a competent clinician. Now, science can't deliver that capability of dealing with complexity and uncertainty, but literary studies can. So one of the key concepts and indeed skills that we begin to teach our literary studies students from the start of their training is the Keatsian concept of negative capability, both a writerly and a readerly state of being able to sit with uncertainty in a literary text, to sit with ambiguity, multiplicity, the weighing of possibilities. That capability to sit with uncertainty and not foreclose any of those possibilities by locking on to concrete, incontrovertible meaning. The attendant skills of close textual analysis, exploring the capacious spaces of language and meaning-making, embracing uncertainty and ambiguity, reading the complex interplay between text and context. These are, in fact, transferable skills in the clinical encounter. For instance, when a patient comes into a consultation, there are multiple possibilities in a patient's presentation. The languages of their speech, the languages of their body. The narratives they bring into the consulting room are in fact rich with clinical detail if the clinician knows how to listen actively, but importantly, not impose early or definitive interpretation. In other words, if a clinician behaves like a literary scholar. Now, negative capability might well then be listed in the GMC's list of core capabilities. Haven't achieved that yet, but maybe one day we will. But what happens if, as literary scholars, we bring this kind of training into the kind of realm of clinical training? So, to come to the kind of case study that I want to offer up to you to kind of think through with you. In line with Neville Chiavaroli's understanding that critical thinking means thinking like a doctor, in 2018, a working group of academics, artists and clinicians from both Birkbeck, which is my previous institution, and St George's Medical School in London, met to think innovatively about how best to bring humanities and medical education together in a way that did not reduce humanities to what Alan Bleakley calls edutainment, I love that term, edutainment for medical education, or conversely, privileges the voice of critical theory over the real-life complex experience of clinical practice. And the conceptual model that we decided to espouse from the outset was transdisciplinarity, applied both to the content of our teaching and also the way in which we came up with this partnership. We created a space which allowed for an organic, intuitive process of module creation between 5 of us from very diverse disciplines: psychiatry, clinical medicine, critical theory, philosophy, literary studies, history of art, and fine art. I want to do two things here. One is to acknowledge the work of my incredible colleagues from George's who we worked with, Annie Bartlett and Deborah Padfield. And the other thing I want to kind of acknowledge here is to pick up on Javier's presentation earlier, this idea of creative inquiry. It was absolutely crucial for us that we weren't just academics, we had artists working with us too. So very much a kind of trinity of clinical medicine, yes, you know, kind of academic disciplines, but also fine art and creative practice, absolutely crucial to what we did. We posed ourselves the following questions as we developed our new model for applied medical humanities teaching. And we asked what it would be like to, 1, teach medical and healthcare students alongside literature, creative writing, theatre studies and liberal arts students so that they could learn from each other as well as from us. What would it be like to have clinical, academic and creative tutors in every session? University management's nightmare, terrible financial model, 3 members of staff in the room at one time, but to have a clinician, an academic and a creative tutor in every session, to teach those materials alongside each other, to comment, to ask questions, to bring our different perspectives to bear in every single session. And then also, and this is why I've shown the kind of estates of both institutions, to teach the sessions across those spaces, to bring humanities students into a hospital setting. They didn't like that very much, but we made them do it. But similarly also to bring the medical students into humanities classrooms, and there was a lot of anxiety about that until COVID hit and we had to go online. But we did. We kind of moved between the different spaces. So one of the modules that we produced is called Finding a Leg to Stand On, Clinical, Critical and Creative Approaches to the Human Body. And we took the leg as a vehicle. That was a joke that we kept making. We took the leg as a vehicle. The students didn't find it that funny. We did. We took the leg as a vehicle to examine the human body through the multiple lenses of medicine, critical and cultural theory, and creative practice. Half the students came from St George's Medical School. The other half were made up of literature, creative writing, theatre studies, and liberal arts students. Asking what is a leg, we brought these very different knowledges to bear upon an object which each student cohort might believe that they understood within their own frames of reference. And in using these different lenses, the leg becomes an object both strange and yet newly knowable. So just as a snapshot on this slide, we would do things like think about anatomical knowledge, and there the kind of medical and healthcare students would kind of, you know, talk about dissection, physiological mapping, clinical examples, patient presentation. We kicked off with anatomy. So the leg in that sense becomes a very material, kind of tangible thing, but several sessions in, after we'd explored phenomenology, and the medical students found that pretty difficult. Actually, so did the humanities students. Merleau-Ponty is very difficult to read. But after we'd gone through a bit of phenomenology, then we had a session on erotics and taboo, and we read the leg in Virginia Woolf's Orlando. And in this scene, if you know Woolf's text at all, this is the moment where the central character, Orlando, has changed sex from male to female and is discovering that if she shows her leg, it's not this, it's different. That's right, people will die, right? A sailor will fall off the mast. I've got to read it. Here she tossed her foot impatiently and showed an inch or two of calf. A sailor on the mast who happened to look down at the moment started so violently that he missed his footing and only saved himself by the skin of his teeth. If the sight of my ankles, if the sight of my ankles means death to an honest fellow, I must in all humanity keep them covered, Orlando thought. Yet her legs were amongst her chiefest beauties. So, you know, we moved from anatomy basically through some philosophy into literary material. Asking the question of what a leg is in relation to this text, of course, yields very different responses. The leg now is both a material object, here dressed very differently from Orlando's previous male attire, revealed accidentally as she makes bodily movements that were previously familiar to her as a man. The skirts part to expose an ankle and calf, and now the leg is a cultural object, gendered female, and therefore possessing an erotic charge that must be carefully managed in public. So navigating these different ways of knowing a leg required clinical and literary scholarly input in each session. A transdisciplinary teaching method that creates learning beyond the two cultures. It's a live dialogue in the classroom with teaching staff modelling the engagement between medicine and the humanities. It wasn't always easy, I have to be honest, particularly the moment where Annie turns to me. I was doing some Descartes, and Annie turns around and goes, "But it's just wrong. But Descartes was just wrong." And I'm like, well, yeah, but we've got to think about how we construct that argument critically, Annie. So, it was sometimes a difficult task. But the other key aspect I want to stress here is the teaching and co-construction undertaken by the students themselves. Small group work, carefully balancing medical and literature student voices, meant navigating those radically different realms was also being driven by students themselves. At times, the medical students would lead literature students through clinical material, and then the roles would reverse, and literature students would lead the medical students through literary and theoretical materials. It's particularly striking, for instance, watching literature and creative writing students working with medical students on a piece of poetry. The medical students were terrified of poetry. And what was really beautiful to watch, actually, was the literature students taking them through and helping them acclimatise to a different kind of uncertainty. The medical students were worried about getting it wrong. And, of course, what the literature students were able to point out to them was, no, you can't really get it wrong. Conversely, and I have to tell this story, I recall one of the times that we took the group to the Pathology Museum at St George's, and in addition to the confrontation for the Birkbeck students of being in close proximity to human specimens, there was the complexity of them trying to understand what they were looking at. In one unforgettable session, actually, some of the Birkbeck students who were completely discombobulated by looking at the body parts asked for a toilet break, got lost, and ended up in the mortuary. So it was just like, okay. Adventures in space, a little bit actually like us kind of last night, the kind of CBD of Cairns. And so anyway, the thing about the Pathology Museum partly is that that's where medical students were able to help the literature students to make sense of what they were looking at. Now, to finish up, and I don't know how I'm doing for time.
Yeah, you've got a little bit more time.
Okay, I want to finish with student voices because this is incredibly important to kind of speak to this kind of lifting our gaze. This is kind of and value actually, which we've talked a lot about. So these student voices, I think, give a very moving account of what it means to move beyond the two cultures, and what a lived and generative encounter between the HAS and the STEM disciplines might actually produce. And we have gone on to write this up as a research article, and it was really important to us that we had student voice at the heart of this work. So Matt is a BA English and Creative Writing student from Birkbeck, and Nanya is a final year medical student from St George's. So I've been talking about uncertainty as an experience situated at the core of literary texts and clinical encounters. But of course, these teaching methods and these modules themselves are constituted out of uncertainty from the very outset. And I think what this first slide picks up on is that kind of embodied uncertainty as the kind of two cohorts of students meet each other for the first time. The medical students are terrified about how clever the literature students will be, and vice versa, this kind of sense of how can I possibly sit and talk to medical students. So what you hear is these kind of the kind of assumptions about how sort of potentially fearful a radically mixed classroom will be, particularly if it's in a hospital setting or a humanities classroom. This kind of projection onto the other group. But without fail, every year that we run this, and we run it for 5 years, those two cohorts become one. It's a very humbling experience to watch it happen, and it's a privilege to be part of that transdisciplinary journey. The value add for the medical students speaks precisely to the importance of applied medical humanities. And if you think back to Hedy Wald's diagnosis that the science of medicine has overwhelmed the art of medicine, here in Ananya's description of what's gained in this module, you start to see some of the restitution of those core skills of critical thinking and reflective practice in clinical practice. So this is Ananya's voice, which hopefully you've had a quick chance to look at. I'm not going to read them out just for interest of time. But I'm going to make one final point and then I'll stop. It's a point I want to conclude with. To go back to this idea that somehow the humanities here are being instrumentalised in the service of medicine, I think it's really important to understand the value add for literature students of actually having a lived encounter with medicine, with medical students, with clinical practice, with a different kind of construction of the body. Because I think this is about lifting the gaze. Literary studies is deeply enriched and extended in its encounter with medicine, and I will read Matt's words here. Considering the body through shared theory, practice and movement enabled knowledge to be produced and transmitted to students in fresh and innovative ways. We learned to consider and experience the lived and indeed the dead body. By becoming more academically active, the body became more known. This reminded us that it's more than just a symbolic construction as so often depicted in art and literature. The transdisciplinary approach taken in Finding a Leg both disrupted and elucidated the theoretical approaches familiar to literature students like myself. So there's something here about the way that theory can become incredibly abstract, and what this does is return to some kind of material lived experience. There was a consensus that clinical language could be inclusive, and engagement with it activated thoughtful and emotional responses. Thinking scientifically we learned did not mean letting go of creativity. So this is not a one-way street. It's not an instrumentalisation of the humanities. Working with medicine provides new ways of thinking and knowing for literature students. It allows them to bridge theory, practice and lived experience in a way that expands their critical capabilities too. To return to Niculescu's pronouncement that, quote, transdisciplinarity offers us a new vision of nature and reality. As we envisage the future of the humanities at such a difficult moment in the history of our disciplines, in which clamorous voices will tell us that their value is so low, let us consider the relationships which help us demonstrate its worth, but also whose generative companionship and dialogue help us to engage with the world more deeply.